So this talk is about science and about faith. About the two subjects seem very often recently to have been portrayed in conflict. So it's about where that conflict exists, and it's also about what we know, what we like to think we know, and what we can't know as well. Now, science, I think, often makes us feel a bit like that, kind of this deer in headlights look. So there won't be too much science, and I'm going to skirt over most things. There's one bit of science that we're going to go through, but it's not particularly hard, and it's actually based in the Bible. So I thought that might be interesting to look at. We're going to look at three different things. We're going to look at biology, physics, and maths, and how they play God with life, play God with the universe, and about knowing everything in maths. So this talk isn't anti-science at all. There's a bit of it that I suppose is anti the portrayal of science in the media, and it's a bit about arrogance as well. So the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project is basically taking somebody's DNA and writing it out on a computer. That's what it sort of comes down to. It's like somebody's taken a car to pieces and they've laid all the pieces out in a great big long line. And that basically is what it's all about. It doesn't, in and of itself, change anything. The Human Genome Project was completed some years ago, and the world hasn't suddenly been transformed. But what it has done is provided a huge amount of data for people to then start working on. In a way, the Human Genome Project is the start of the science rather than being the end of the science, if you like. Just as, if you've taken a car to pieces, then you can start studying how it works. You've got something to work on at that point. That's basically the project and how it's turned about. So this is far more about journalists than scientists. I've got a couple of quotes from the BBC and from another chap. And so both these quotes were written before the gene had been sequenced for humans. So this is the BBC. If we can create life in a lab from scratch, will it alter our view of what we are? Will we, in a sense, have become gods? So that's the BBC from, I think that's 4 or 5 years ago. A chap called John Katz, who is a journalist in America, finding the formula for life would dwarf almost any previous scientific achievement that comes to mind, not to mention knocking conventional religion and theology on their antiquated behinds. What is a theologian supposed to tell some kid who can read the recipe for human life? If we can make it, doesn't that raise certain ultimate questions? And I think quite a few people had this view of the Human Genome Project, that it was going to do away with religion. Clearly it hasn't, because we're still here. And they have sequenced the complete DNA of, I think, something like 40 people now. The Human Genome Project does not give us the answer to life. And I don't think any scientist ever actually thought that it would do. Journalists, on the other hand, like to have fantastic stories to write, and so that's how you get some of those headlines that you got earlier. Obviously, it has the potential to help us analyse hereditary problems and that sort of thing. I'm not trying to knock the Human Genome Project as useless, but the way it's reported frequently is not at all helpful. And the point really is this: understanding genetics by looking at it is a whole lot different from having created it in the first place. If you take a car to pieces and you study the pieces very carefully and you work out how to create a new car, that's not really creating a car from scratch. That's taking somebody else's car and rebuilding it. I'm reminded of a story. Some scientists, maybe this lot, go to God and they say, we've got no need for you anymore. We've discovered how to create life and manipulate life. That makes us gods, so we have no need for you. And God says, well, hang on, I'm not so sure about this. And men say, no, we can do this. We'll have a competition if you like. We'll go and make some life to demonstrate that we're right. So God says, okay, go on then. And the men stoop down and get some dirt. And God says, hang on, get your own dirt. And the point is, simply rebuilding what God has created doesn't suddenly make us gods at all. The best we have managed to do is to understand what God has already done. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes, shrewd in their own sight. Every generation likes to think that it's the ultimate in knowledge. We look back scornfully on what they thought a few years ago, and kind of forget that in a few years' time we'll be looking back on what we thought now somewhat scornfully. What on earth did they think? In 2009, they got no idea then. We all like to look back, on the past and what we didn't know then. And I think the two examples from the BBC and from John Katz are great examples of that. We look back at them now and think, well, that's kind of silly, predicting these wonderful things about the Human Genome Project, which, clearly didn't come true. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. If anyone imagines that he knows something he does not yet know as he ought to know, there's two routes from knowledge. I've had the privilege at work of meeting a lot of very smart people, and knowledge tends, I think, to do one of two things to you. It either makes you think, wow, I know all this stuff, I must be really clever, or it makes you think, crumbs, there's a huge amount of stuff that I don't know. And Isaac Newton is a fantastic example. Now, obviously I never met him personally. A lot of people say that he wasn't actually a nice chap, and a lot of people say, for example, that he was quite arrogant. Now, obviously I never met him, and I don't know. I do know about what he wrote down, however. If I've seen a little further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And he likened to himself, he said he was like a little boy playing on the seashore, diverting myself now and again, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. And I think both of those are the correct kind of an attitude to thinking that you know something, rather than becoming arrogant, realising just how much there is out there. And unfortunately, sometimes we all have a tendency to go off the deep end in thinking that we know stuff, when actually we don't know as we yet ought. So, that's a bit about biology. I'd like to move on to physics. You may have seen something like this before. There are 4 forces in nature. There's gravity. We're familiar with gravity. It's what holds us to the planet. It's what holds the universe together. It gives us air to breathe. And it was discovered by a whole bunch of people. Galileo saw some of it. Newton famously saw more of it. And Einstein refined the theories more still. So that's the first thing, is gravity. Second thing is electricity and magnetism. Now, pretty much every other force that we ever feel is down to electricity and magnetism. If it's not gravity, and we all understand gravity, then it'll be down to electricity or magnetism, pretty much everything. So the third thing is the strong nuclear force. Now, that's what holds atoms together. I don't suppose any of us have ever felt it, because it's about keeping atoms together and nothing to do with us at all. And the last one is the weak nuclear force. And this is the point where you can go blah, 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 because we don't need to know about it at all, other than that it exists. We can adopt the deer in headlight approach. So there's 4 things. Gravity holds the universe together. Electricity and magnetism, which are all the forces that we are used to. Weak nuclear force that holds atoms, strong nuclear force holds atoms together. Weak nuclear force we don't need to bother with, other than to know that it exists. So that's all of the forces in the universe, think scientists. And scientists are trying to put them together, trying to say, physicists are trying to think that they understand everything. And so they have this thing called the electroweak force, and there's this idea that you can put those two things together. And that's a fairly well-established theory. Then there's this thing called the electronuclear force, which attempts to put those three things together. And there is finally one further thing called the theory of everything, which is supposed to put the whole lot together. I don't know if you've ever read The Brief History of Time, the Stephen Hawking book. This is what he says at the end of A Brief History of Time. If we do discover a complete theory, he's talking about this grand theory of everything, it should be understandable in broad principle, not just by a few scientists, but by everyone, not just a few scientists. Then we shall all, philosophers, scientists and ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we and the universe exist. And if we answer that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. I was having a go at journalists earlier for getting too arrogant, and I think it is not unfair to criticise Stephen Hawking here for having jumped the shark in what he thinks we all ought to know. The idea that this grand theory of everything should be understandable in broad principle by everyone, when nobody in the world understands it at the moment, is, I think, quite a jump. So this is what they're trying to do, trying to put everything together like this. I'm sure you're aware of the Large Hadron Collider, this great big expensive science project that's not working in CERN at the moment. What they are trying to do there, amongst other things, is to discover this thing called the Higgs boson. Now, the Higgs boson is what kind of proves that they've got their theories about the green electronuclear force together. And it's been called the God particle. It's been called the God particle because people like to blow things up in unreasonable ways. So this is a chap called Stephen Weinberg. Now, to be fair, he doesn't generally use the word God particle. I put it in italics. But he says this: as science explains more and more, there is less and less need for religious explanations. The Higgs boson, the God particle, does take away. I typed that in wrongly. Does take away one of the original motivations for religion. And so it's not just Stephen Hawking. There are a number of scientists who have, I think, overinflated views of what they're doing. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. I think it's a natural feeling to think that we're right. Obviously, if we didn't think we were right, we'd think we were wrong, and therefore we'd change our minds. So we kind of always think we're right. But the reality is, actually, a lot of the time we're wrong. The reality is we're nowhere near as right as we think we are, however brilliant we are. Now, I heard Jeff and Ken say earlier they were doing a talk on evolution at Sunday school. And you were saying, I think it was Ken, was talking about how evolution is a theory. That's how you started, right? Now, it's not just evolution. Obviously, Newton's theories are theories. Einstein's theories are theories. There's a reason why all of these things are theories, and that is that we can never actually be sure. So we could imagine, me doing an investigation into speech, and I look around and I have this theory that everyone speaks English. Because I go around and I look at everyone in the room and everyone here speaks English. So I write my theory, Joe's first theory of language, everyone speaks English. And I have that as my theory, and then I do a bit of an investigation, and I happen to go to France and I discover that it's not true. And I modify my theory, and my new theory is everyone speaks some sort of a language. And then I do a bit more investigation, and I discover actually that's not true either. And that's how theories work. It's the reason that they're theories is that I can never actually talk to everybody. I can never actually go everywhere, and I can never actually do my tests everywhere. So everything is a theory, because we can't ever actually test everything. So that is what we do as scientists. We sort of look from the top down to try and work out how it works. Now, mathematicians attempted to do something different, and what they attempted to do was to look from the bottom up and to build everything up from maths. Some simple maths, and you put the pieces of maths together, and you make more and more complicated bits of maths, and after a while the maths turn into bits of physics, and after a while the bits of physics turn into bits of chemistry, and after a while the bits of chemistry turn into bits of biology, and before you know it, the mathematicians have worked everything out from the bottom up rather than the top down. That was the theory. So I want to talk about limits to what we know. We've really looked at how looking things from the top down, i.e. just observing things, we can't ever know anything properly, because you can never actually observe everything. So Gödel and Heisenberg. Kurt Gödel was, well, he was an Austro-Hungarian, Czech, German-American. He moved around a bit. He was a brilliant mathematician, and changed the way maths worked for many people. He was a sad character, though. He moved to all these places because he was born in Hungary and ended up getting caught in the Nazi conflict and ran away to America through all these places. He eventually died because he was convinced that somebody was trying to poison him. So he ended up starving himself to death. Not a happy character in his closing days. But when he was young, there's a chap called David Hilbert. Now, David Hilbert was attempting to do this thing of building up from the very small pieces to prove everything from first principles. That's what David Hilbert was trying to do. But Kurt Gödel proved that he was on a futile quest and that you couldn't do it. He's got this, and I know my maths is nowhere good enough to even understand what he's going on about here. He's got this proof of the existence of God, which I mentioned just in passing, just because I think that's crazy. But clearly a smart bloke nonetheless. Now this is the verse in the Bible on which this is based. Obviously, Kurt Gödel was a Christian. So this is Titus 1:12. One of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." Does that verse stand out in any way to anyone? And wonder why I might be interested in it? It contradicts itself, yes. In that, the verse is absolutely fine, but the question is, are Cretans always liars? Because if Cretans are always liars, presumably the Cretan was lying when he said Cretans are always liars. And therefore, Cretans are not always liars. In that case, he might be telling the truth. And it's an old thing. It's called the Epimenides paradox. This sentence is false is a great example. If it's false, then it's not true. So the converse must be true, and therefore the sentence is true. And any way you try and analyse it, it comes back to the flip of what you thought it was, and you end up getting yourself very confused. So this is not a new thing. And I can't help thinking that verse is in Titus deliberately, and it's not a mistake at all. Now, what Kurt Gödel said was a similar kind of a thing. There was an island, and on the island there is only one barber. All of the men on the island either shave themselves or they are shaved by the barber. This is the rule. And we all think that's absolutely fine, no problem with that. We understand what's going on. But the mathematician looks at it and he says, well, does that mean the barber shaves himself or not? And goes through this same thing of flipping, analyse it one way and it comes out one way, and disproves itself. And what Kurt Gödel did was to turn this into a maths problem. And to say, here is a maths problem which, if you prove to be correct, will prove itself incorrect. And you therefore cannot prove this true. It looks true, but you can't prove it. And in doing that, what he said was, well, look, you can't look at things from the top and know everything, and you can't work things up from the bottom and know everything, simply because the maths won't let you. And I have proved that there are a whole bunch of theorems which look right, but you cannot prove that they are right. So it doesn't matter whether you look at science from the top or whether you look at maths from the bottom up. We can never actually know everything that is going on. This is Job 38. Thus far shall you come and no farther, and here your proud waves will be stayed. And I think God was absolutely right in saying this. God planned right from the very beginning that there will be limits to what we could know. We can never actually observe everything from the top, and we can't work it up from the bottom either. All we can do is have a bunch of theories. This was written, 4,000 years ago. Job 38 has a stunning bunch of questions which we can't answer and we can't match of God. Now, I'm not going to talk about Heisenberg in any detail at all. He's an interesting character because he was Germany's Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was an American chap who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb at the end of the Second World War and brought an end to the Second World War. Well, Heisenberg was Germany's Oppenheimer. He was trying to do the same thing in Germany. And the fact that he failed changed the world. Because had he succeeded, the Germans would have used it. But nevertheless, despite the fact that he failed to create the atomic bomb for Germany, and whether or not he was trying, I'm not entirely sure that is true either. He has a similar theory, which I don't want to go into, but basically is the traffic cop's nightmare. You can know how fast something was going, but not where it is, or you can know where it is, in which case you don't know how fast it was going. And it's about atomic particles. It's not actually true at the level of a car. Pity, really. But that's another limit to what we can know. And there are others also. We could talk about other ways in which what we know is not just limited by what we've seen, but, at a fundamental level, science is, unable to tell us the answers because we've discovered that science says you cannot know the answers, if you see what I mean. It's not just that we haven't looked hard enough. We cannot know. That there are limits, it's not through lack of study. Neither study nor arrogance can overcome the limits that God has placed on what we know. Just remembering Gödel, this is Freeman Dyson, who's a theoretical physicist. Gödel's theorem implies that pure maths is inexhaustible. Because of Gödel's theorem, physics is inexhaustible too. The laws of physics are a finite set of rules and include the rules for doing maths, so that Gödel's theorem applies to them. What he's saying is we can carry on working things out forever, and we will never know everything. And I quoted Stephen Hawking earlier, and what I think was a fairly arrogant statement in the brief history of time. This is what he thinks now. I suspect he would agree that it was an arrogant thing to say. Some people will be very disappointed if there is not an ultimate theory that can be formulated as a finite number of principles. I used to belong to that camp, but I changed my mind. And I suspect that he has come to the realisation that it's just not possible for man to work everything out and to get it all known. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, declares... neither are my ways your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. It's clear that right from the very beginning, God knew that there were limits on what we could know, and put bounds on how much we could understand. So this isn't particularly about the limits to what we can know. I've always found this verse interesting. You, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. I should perhaps think about this verse more when I'm dashing across the Atlantic. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So one final thing about what we know. Now, this is how Dawkins likes to portray science and faith. He says science is what we know and faith is what we guess at. And so that's the way he tries to portray it. And so over time, there's this shift. And gradually, Science, he says, takes over the bits we don't know. That is his idea. And I think with what we've been looking at this evening, we can say that that's the wrong way of looking about things. That's not the distinction between science and faith at all. And science is certainly never going to move right the way over to the left-hand side, right-hand side, depending on how you're looking at it. And this, I think, is the distinction between science and faith. Science tells us how things happened, and faith tells us why things happened. Science will tell us the building blocks, maybe, but we have to turn to faith to understand why, what our purpose is, and why God made us. So finally, to sum up, science isn't disproving God. Whatever scientists may happen to say sometimes, whatever journalists say, this isn't, again, we're at the end of it, we suddenly discover there's no need for what we believe. Science isn't ever going to win in that sense. And I think this is a lesson for all of us. And that is, arrogance is a barrier to thinking clearly and thinking straightforwardly. And it's something we should all remember, because it affects all of us. It's easy for any of us to become arrogant. The views that we get from Isaac Newton's writing, if I have seen further, it is merely by standing on the shoulders of giants, are a far more healthy way to think about life.